and be prioritized. Are members agreeable to the plan? Okay. And before, I would just like to advise the committee, I would like to set 10 minutes aside before conclusion to discuss the Centennial Flame bursary, and the clerk will brief us on that. As well, I would also I want to receive direction from the committee as to the agenda for the meeting on Monday, February the 7th, 2020, and the first hour of the meeting on Thursday, February 10th, 2020. The floor is now open, and I recognize Madame Zerillo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's nice to see you for the first time in 2022. In person, I mean. We need more of that, I think. The committee members have brought a robust group of motions to address concerns in their ridings and across Canada. And I'm very happy to see all of the motions today, all the notices of motions. I have 3 myself, one that addresses income support for persons with disabilities, one that addresses Indigenous housing, and the third to address labour shortages, which is very important to this committee from the motions that I've seen. It's the motion around the labour shortages that I will be moving now, so I'd like to move with a focus on the care economy that includes personal support workers, care aides, medical professionals, including veterinarians and childcare workers, all who have been on the front lines of care during this pandemic. Through the chair, that pursuant to the Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake a study of the labour shortages and workers' conditions within the care economy, including healthcare workers, personal support workers, and childcare workers who have been on the front lines of COVID-19, and examine how the government, in collaboration with the provinces and territories, should implement long-term investments in the care economy, that the government, in collaboration with the provinces and territories, improve credential recognition for Canadians and permanent residents who have been trained abroad, that the committee invite the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion, experts and departmental officials to testify, that the committee hold at least 5 meetings, and that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madame Zerillo. We would now go to Madame Chabot.
Bonjour, Monsieur. Good afternoon, colleagues and Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to be here and to have heard this latest motion with the idea to invite the ministers, and that our agenda will allow for that. I think it's very important for us to undertake our future work and our hopes to complete that work. I have tabled 4 motions, one on the labour shortage, one concerning the study on seniors, one concerning on the temporary foreign workers program, and one on contract flipping. So I would like to table the motion on the labour shortage, and I think that that is a priority. We should move to that first. If we look at the 4 parties tabling motions today, we can see that each one of us has tabled one on labour shortages, and probably there will be a consensus to this effect. I hope that this will be a priority motion. So I will read the motion that, pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake... Point of order?
Désolée.
I'm sorry? I'm tabling my motion as the chair invited us to do.
Madame Chabot, there's already a motion on the floor by Madame Zerillo, and I would ask anybody to direct their comments to the motion currently on the floor from Madame Zerillo. And Mr. Collins, did you have your hand up to speak on that?
Yep, thanks, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to speak to Madame Zerillo's
motion. It is a good one, and I think as Madame Chabot just
Point
referenced.
d'ordre, Monsieur le Président.
A point of order, Mr. Chair, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, rather. Would it be possible to ask people who have stopped speaking to put their hand down, because otherwise it's really difficult to know who's asking to speak. I can see that Ms. Chabot has raised her hand, but it's difficult to know when she did that.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman. I will put my hand down if you're saying that we need to debate the previous motion that was tabled. And I have to say that I can't see the people who are physically present.
Chabot, yes, I would ask when you conclude once you're recognized, to lower your hand so that it's clear at a change. We're in discussion and debate on the motion moved by Madame Zerillo. Mr. Collins?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, again, and through you to Madame Zerillo, a terrific motion in terms of, as that was noted earlier, there are a number of motions that have been presented to the committee that speak to labor shortages, and so I'm certainly supportive of what's in front of us here, but I wondered if there was an opportunity for some massaging of the language, and if you would provide me an opportunity to present an amendment, I'd like to put it to the committee for their consideration, and that is, I'll read it out, and if you need me to read it again, I'm certainly willing to do so. And that's pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake a study of the labor shortages and workers' conditions within the care economy, including healthcare workers, personal support workers, and child care workers who have been on the front lines of COVID-19, and examine how the government, in collaboration with provinces and territories, could improve working conditions in the care economy, that the committee proceed to an overview on the impact of the labor shortages in the Canadian workforce on the first meeting of the study, and that committee invite the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability and Inclusion, experts and departmental officials to testify, that the committee hold at least 6 meetings, and that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House. And so, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know if you have all of that then in terms of, and whether the clerk needs anything from me in that regard. Essentially, it's changing the language, as you note, in the middle of the motion and adding another meeting to the study.
Currently, then, we have an amendment on the floor. The debate will now focus on the amendment to the motion by Madame Zerillo. I will ask the clerk to circulate. Do you have the exact text of the amendment? Okay. And while we're doing that, I just want to outline to those virtually who is in the room. There's Madame Kuzi, there's Mr. Ruff, Madame Zerillo, and we have joining from the Green Party, Mr. Maurice, and we have Mr. Collins and Madame Ferrata in the committee room. So, clerk, do you have the? It's been circulated. So, committee members, you have the amendment by Mr. Collins, Madame Kuzi.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. We are in support of the amendment. We appreciate Mr. Collins' perspective that this definitely is a broad topic as brought forward by Madame Zerillo. And
On the amendment.
I'm not sure if, let's see. In fact, we are so in accordance with Mr. Collins' suggestion of the language change and changing it from 5 meetings to 6 meetings that we would like to expand the scope. So I'm not sure if, Clerk, if I would do that with a sub-amendment to the amendment, or if we vote on this amendment. Most probably, we would vote on this amendment, and then I would suggest another amendment to the main motion as amended. Excuse me. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Madame Kuzi.
Coolio.
Thank you, Madame Kuzi. Madame Chabot on the amendment.
According to the amendment, if I understood the spirit of it, it would be to broaden it to study the impacts on the labor shortages on the market. I would appreciate receiving it in French, even if that's not the rule, please. But on the substance of it, For the first part, can I speak to that?
Non?
Yes, to the amendment. You're speaking on the amendment.
Ben, l'amendement,
Well, the amendment is amending a motion that is amending a motion, the beginning of which I am not in agreement with, because it's talking about labor shortages and workers' conditions within the care economy, which includes healthcare workers, personal support workers, and childcare workers. And with all due respect for the sensitivity that we might have to healthcare workers and workers in childcare centers, who we know have been on the front lines since COVID, I think that, in my opinion, it's not really a study that would come under our committee. I think that healthcare labor shortages or labor shortages in healthcare sectors, rather, really should be an area of provincial jurisdiction, and it's not up to us to do studies on those issues, which are provincial areas. As I said, I could speak at length about Quebec, which has action plans to deal with labor shortages in this area, and all of this deals with working conditions and negotiations that are underway, and this is not at all a federal area of jurisdiction. It's not at all up to us to speak to this. Every province has its areas of jurisdictions for these issues that affect workers, and to do a study on the labor shortages in a sector that is not part of our area of jurisdiction is something I disagree with. So even with the amendment, it is attached to a motion that is completely dealing with health care, and I cannot vote for that. And I would invite the members of the committee to look carefully at this in terms of impact. I don't think that we're moving issues forward if we're working on issues that are not under our jurisdiction. It's not in our power to do anything about working conditions for people working in healthcare. It doesn't come under us. So there are different models from province to province in terms of childcare, and for healthcare that's delivered, it's the same thing. So in Quebec, this is an area that we have big unions in negotiation with the provincial government, and so I think that we're getting into work there that will lead us I don't know where, but it's really not part of our jurisdiction. And this is Quebec's. And however, we know that labor shortages that are hitting the broader economy, and I looked at a report of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. The House of Commons mentioned it. It was mentioned today there. We know that we've been hard hit by in the area of transportation, and so we need to discuss how this labor shortage in Canada in these broader sectors affect the Canadian economy and study those issues, and not to studying issues that are completely under areas of provincial jurisdiction. So I disagree with the amendment. I disagree with the amendment to a motion that I cannot agree to in the first place.
Thank you, Madame Chabot. The amendment is admissible, and it's within the scope of the committee. Is there any further, Mr. Coteau?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mr. Chair. I would say that this is I think, a very good motion. I think, contrary to the last member's statement around provincial federal jurisdiction, there's no question that labor shortages are impacted, or just labor in general are impacted by federal policy, from immigration to skill development to transfer payments. I think there's a huge opportunity for us to look at the main motion as something we as policymakers can develop to contribute to to better coordination federally, but also interprovincially by working in partnership with the provinces to really put in place strategies that meet their needs from an immigration and skill development perspective. So I think it's a good motion for us to support. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bynon. Sorry, Mr. Coutu will now, Mr. Bynon, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the previous sitting of the House, I had the privilege of sitting on the HESA committee, the Healthcare Committee, along with Mr. Generou. And I think the one thing that we discovered throughout this pandemic is how integrated the healthcare system is. And those are delivery points not from a national point of view, but from a provincial point of view, from a regional point of view, and a municipal point of view. And so I think there's a very integrated dynamic that needs to be considered as we go forward. In addition to that, there are a number of national studies that are being undertaken in terms of healthcare. And I think this motion touches base on some of the very fundamental dynamics of what it is we are trying to accomplish in terms of making this a safer place to live in a healthier country. So I think this is quite appropriate, and I will be supporting that motion and the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Bynon. Mr. Generou, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, I just wanted to take what I think might be a rare opportunity that me and Mr. Van Bynen are in complete agreement. So I wanted to get that on the record while I could. But I agree. We had a lot of that crossover, and I appreciate my friend Ms. Van Bynen bringing that up.
Mr. Generou, Madame Zerillo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just wanted to comment on Madame Chabot's comments because I would really like us to become to a place where we are unanimous on working on these labor shortage issues. So I just wanted to express to Madame Chabot that we will be respecting within the jurisdictions that are healthcare focused, but this really is about the idea of how do we get more people into this care economy, and around immigration this is a huge point of contact, especially for care workers and care aides. This is really all expansive look at labor shortages, and with a lead on the care economy, which we all know with this tsunami of boomers that are coming at age 65 right away, that we want to make sure that we can handle another crisis. So I take her point. We will respect jurisdiction, but I hope we can come to a point where we can start looking at these labor shortages and be prepared to take care of people in the future.
Thank you, Madame Zerillo. Madame Ferrata.
Oui, merci. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to support the terms of the motion, but particularly with the amendment. I think the idea that we would like to bring forward is that we have to have a general idea of what's happening in labor shortages in the sector, in the situation that we find ourselves in, but to put a particular emphasis on the care economy. We are in the pandemic context, and as Ms. Zerillo was saying, while respecting the provincial areas of jurisdiction, of course, but also with the intention of the government to be present and to help the healthcare system across the country, because people not only need to have a healthcare system that meets their needs, but also we need to keep them all healthy. So I support the amendment tabled by my colleague.
I see no further. Madame Chabot, speak the amendment.
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you. I put my hand down and I put it back up. Yes, still on the same issue. Look, I'm raising an issue. The motion speaks about conditions, working conditions of this staff. So I'm not surprised to see a motion that is very centralizing and deals with Quebec's jurisdictions, but I'm really disappointed. It's not that I want to oppose the whole issue of labor shortages, which is so major in our economy, in the Canadian economy. It's well documented, and on the contrary, everyone is talking about this in their motions. There's a conservative motion that was much more general. There's a liberal motion that was talking about agri-food, and ours had the benefit of being broader and having a more macro view of things. But in this one, to really target the care economy and those workers in the healthcare field, whereas in British Columbia, the role of a personal healthcare worker in the organization of services is certainly not the same thing as what it is in Quebec. In Quebec, we have professional organizations that deal with training, and so it deals with issues that are healthcare delivery areas that are provincial areas of jurisdiction. So I'm not opposed to studying the labor shortage, but I don't know if you realize that we're targeting a sector that is completely provincial jurisdiction. So working conditions for childcare workers, I mean, we've had a system for 25 years. There are ratios with very young children, and this comes under the Ministry of Families. There's very specific training. There are contexts where there are labor shortages, yes, and all of this is very well documented and managed. This is an area that provincial finance ministries deal with. So we don't need to do a big study on this. We'll convince everyone that what the provinces are lacking is that the federal government pay its fair share for healthcare services. So that's it. The issues of immigration, economic immigration, once again, for the province of Quebec, that's a provincial area of jurisdiction. The whole issue of temporary foreign workers, it affects the care economy much less than the economy in general. So I think that we should have, yes, a broad consensus on the labor shortage because it is affecting the Canadian economy. But what I can't understand is that we want to focus here on the care economy that is an exclusive area of provincial jurisdiction.
Before we move on, I would remind committee members we are speaking to the amendment, and I will recognize next Madame Kuzi, followed by Madame Zarello. Madame Kuzi, you have the floor on the amendment.
Yeah, thank you very much. And again, we are open to the amendment as presented, but certainly I believe. Certainly, I know my colleague, Madame Chabat, is always interested as to the differentiation between the federal and provincial jurisdictions. And I certainly understand that concern and her input there. And I just wanted to indicate that, our concern remains that the study is not too narrow, and as a result of having the 6 meetings that we've begun to broaden it with the amendment in discussing the labor shortages in the Canadian workforce in the first meeting of the study, but just with the to sort of have it known that our intention, and as I said, I'll make an amendment to the main motion once this amendment is dealt with to follow through on our intent of having the possibility of a broader study. Because certainly, while the care economy is incredibly important and crucial, as we've seen throughout this, the labor force jobs report, which is of course due out again tomorrow, has shown historic numbers within other sectors, including retail, hospitality, and manufacturing. So I think we're on the right path here with this amendment in terms of extending it to 6 meetings from 5. The impact of labor shortages, that the last part of the amendment discuss with implementing the words the Canadian, or excuse me, inserting the words the Canadian workforce on the first meeting, but just to say the direction we're moving in is to make it broader. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madame Kuzi. Madame Zarillo, you have the floor
thank-
on the amendment.
And I just wanted to say I'm open to the amendment on removing the investment and making it as working conditions, and I'm looking forward to hearing the sub-amendments that will come from Madame Kusi. And I just wanted to address to Madame Chabot, I am also open to amendments if there is restrictions that she would like to, narrow it in on. And as far as jurisdictions, I'm open to those. But I just wanted to share that, it is difficult to talk about women's issues. I'm a female politician or a woman politician, and it is awkward sometimes to talk about women's issues. And the care economy is disproportionately a women's issue, and I just needed to be elevating that conversation around how much women have carried the burden of care during this pandemic. And also wanted to share that I was fortunate enough. I feel that I'm sitting in this chair today because of the $5 daycare in Quebec. I was one of the first parents to be able to take care of it, take advantage of that program in 1998, and I was able to go back to school. And so I feel strongly that it's a wonderful program. Two of my kids benefited. I benefited from two of my kids. And lastly, I just want to say my constituents are asking me for some accountability around transfers that are coming from the federal government. So I'm always open to exploring how we can get more people into these professions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madame Zarillo. Seeing no further interventions on the amendment, I would ask the mover of the amendment to repeat the amendment, and then we'll move to a vote on the amendment. Mr. Collins.
Thanks. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And it's that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake a study of the labor shortages and workers' conditions within the care economy, including healthcare workers, personal support workers, and childcare workers who have been on the front lines of COVID-19, and examine how the government, in collaboration with provinces and territories, could improve working conditions in the care economy, that the committee proceed to an overview on the impact of labor shortages in the Canadian workforce on the first meeting of the study, and that the committee invite the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion, experts and departmental officials to testify, and that the committee hold at least 6 meetings, and that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House.
Thank you. The amendment has been moved. You've heard. I'll ask the clerk to do a recorded vote on the amendment.
Mr. Long? Mr. Long?
Support.
Mr. Coteau?
In favor.
Mr. Collins?
Yes.
Mr. Van Bynen?
Yes.
Madame Martinez-Ferrada?
Oui.
Ms. Kuzi?
In favor.
Mr. Genereux?
In favor.
Mr. Benson?
In favor.
Mr. Ruff?
In favor.
Madame Chabot?
Contre.
Ms. Zarillo?
In favor.
10 yeas, 1 nay.
The amendment has been carried. I believe Madame Kuzi.
Yes, thank you, Chair.
You have the floor.
I appreciate that. Building on the amended motion, as I mentioned, our greatest concern is that we don't limit ourselves in the evaluation of the labor shortage, which I believe is the second greatest economic crisis facing our country at this time, second only to inflation. And I believe that the labor shortage feeds into inflation in terms of allowing less goods to go to market as a result of no processors, no producers, et cetera. So in keeping with the spirit of the amendment from Mr. Collins, which was, I believe, to expand the scope of the study, I would like to build on that spirit and amend amend the original motion to read that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake a study of the labor shortages and workers' condition within the entirety of the Canadian economy, including but not limited to. So really just to expand the scope. I think it's wonderful. Madame Zerillo feels such passion for this segment of the labor force, and I agree with her, the impact that they have felt. But I believe as we look forward as a nation and to rebuilding our economy, we must also consider the other sectors which have been significantly impacted by the labor shortage, as I said, which is, I believe, greatly influencing the lives of Canadians. Their businesses, goods available, as I mentioned previously, including retail, hospitality, and manufacturing. So I'm hoping that it will be the will of the committee to expand the intention of the study so that there is the opportunity to examine all facets of significant facets of the economy and significant sectors which have been affected. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madame Kuzi. So to be clear, this is an amendment of the main motion. Okay, Madame Zerillo on the amendment currently on the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank Madam Kusi for her amendment. And actually, we might find that there are many similar barriers. We might find that if we expand to look at some other areas, that we would uncover some other problems. So, I am open to the amendment. I'm just wondering about how we allocate for topics for days and meetings. But I'm definitely think that uncovering barriers for all is an interesting idea.
Yes, okay.
Sure.
Mr. Coteau,
Yep.
and then I will go to Madame Ferrata and then Madame Kuzi. Mr. Coteau?
Thank you, Chair. Can we see the wording for that?
It's being circulated. It will be in a moment. That's supposed to
Thank
be
you.
controlled from behind me. Thanks for pointing that out. Are you concluded, Mr. Coteau, or?
Mr. Chair, I am concluded.
Okay. Madame Ferrata, and then Madame Kuzi, and then, yes.
Oui, merci, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To answer Ms. Zerillo, I think we could discuss the number of witnesses we want to hear from and how we could organize the study. And the whole interest of the motion is to look at healthcare for the moment, but I think that if we give ourselves a minimum number of days to study it, we can decide as a committee to take a little more time if we feel that there is a need to extend the study, indeed, so that everyone would be able to have the time to ask the questions they want to ask of the witnesses we'll invite, so that we can respect the motion. And I support the amendment.
Madame Ferrata and Madame Zerillo, if the motion is adopted, then how the study will be conducted will be determined by the committee. Who comes, dates, meetings. So that will be a further discussion should the motion be carried. Madame Kuzi, you had your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to thank Madame Zerillo for her goodwill in being open to this amendment, and I feel confident perhaps our analysts could, with the clerk, could provide some structure as to how we might see the study structured, keeping in mind the original intention of Madame Zerillo and of the original intention of her motion, but broadening beyond that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Ruff, and then Mr. Coteau and Mr. Bynon.
Thanks, Chair. No, I just wanted to voice my support, obviously, behind this amendment. Every one of our ridings is slightly different. We all have different sectors, but by far, the thing I heard most just during the federal election was the labor shortages and the challenges right across all sectors. So I just think it's really important we take the opportunity to broaden this out. I have no issues with, the issues with, I have a few hospitals, obviously, I think we all do in each of our ridings about the care economy. I do share some of the same concerns as Madam Chabot, would stay within our jurisdiction at the federal level, not interfering in our provinces. However, there's, I think, great ways from the federal side that we can continue to contribute and make sure the policies coming down from the federal government do enable and help our provinces. So I'm very much in support of this amendment, and I think it will allow us for all of us to get the respective issues brought forth and debated, and so that we can come up with the best policy going forward. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Ruff. I had Mr. Coteau. You had your hand up. You still want to speak, or?
No, that was a legacy hand up. So
good. Then
no.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Collins, and then Mr. Bynon.
I think Mr. Bynon was Van Bynon was before me. If you want to go to him and come to me next.
Okay, Mr. Bynon.
Thank you.
Mr. Collins conceded to you. We cannot hear you, Mr. Bynon. You're on mute.
Thank you. My apologies, Mr. Chair. I support the general thrust of the motion and the intent. My only concern is if we broaden this far too much, we might dilute the effectiveness and the impact of it. And I think at a time like this, we need to make sure that we are in better condition in the event that we have yet another pandemic in front of us. And that's the reason why I was keen to see us focus on the care economy. And I understand very much that it's important for us to do that for the rest. But I was hoping that we'd be able to prioritize that simply because the sense of urgency is there. And I wouldn't want to dilute the effectiveness of the study and the recommendations in that it might be too broad.
Thank you, Mr. Bynon. Mr. Collins, you have the
I was
floor.
going to raise a very similar issue to Mr. Van Bynon, Mr. Chairman. So I'm on for, I think I agree with Mr. Ruff in terms of so many sectors have been affected by labor shortages, and we're looking for ways and means in which to assist them. I know in my own riding, as Madame Chabot had highlighted, agri-food is a big thing. A company, Salerno, has reached out to talk about their challenges, and then of course all of our home builders across the country in terms of supply shortages and those things, and just finding skilled trade workers to assist them in building homes and building units has been a tremendous challenge, not just in Hamilton, but across the country. So I'm anxious to have a discussion about how we follow through with Madame Zarillo's motion, but understanding we can't look at everything, and we really need to narrow that scope down in terms of a couple of sectors. So those are my comments. And I'm certainly supportive of Madame Kuzi's amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Seeing no further interventions, we'll proceed to vote on the amendment of Madame Kuzi. I will ask the clerk I'll ask the mover to state the amendment, restate the amendment.
Sure. Thank you so much. That pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake a study of the labor shortages and workers' conditions within the entirety of the Canadian economy, including but not limited to the care economy, including healthcare workers, personal support workers, and childcare workers who have been on the front lines of COVID-19, and examine how the government, in collaboration with the provinces and territories, could improve working conditions in the care economy, that the committee proceed to an overview of the impact of the labor shortages in the Canadian workforce on the first meeting of the study, that the committee invite the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion, experts and departmental officials to testify, that the committee hold at least 6 meetings, and that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House.
Thank you, Madame Kuzi. The committee members have heard the amendment. I will ask the clerk to call the recorded vote.
Mr. Long,
Support.
Mr. Coteau,
Support.
Mr. Collins,
Support?
Mr. Van Bynen,
Yes.
Madame Martinez Ferrara,
Oui.
Ms. Kuzi,
In favor?
Mr. Genereux,
In favor.
Mr. Benson,
In favor.
Mr. Ruff,
In favor.
Madame Chabot,
Pardon. Je m'abstiens.
I abstain.
Rillo.
Favor.
10 yeas, 0 nays.
The amendment is carried. Before we move to the main motion, Madame Ferrata?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would have a final amendment to suggest. I'm sorry I didn't have the opportunity to distribute it, but I would just like to move an amendment to add at the end of the motion that pursuant to Standing Order 109, the committee requests that the government table a comprehensive response to the government. And I don't know if we could add somewhere in the motion that this be the first study of this committee. I would like to add that as to the amendment if my colleagues would agree.
The clerk will circulate the amendment moved by Madame Ferrata. Just so we're clear, Madame Ferrata, do you want to include in the amendment this study, the first study, so we would be prioritizing, or leave that to a later time?
On peut juste peut-être.
Well, perhaps we could just agree at the end that if it's the wish of the committee, that doesn't have to be part of the amendment.
Thank you for your direction. Does everybody have the amendment? Okay, seeing no discussion or what's to discuss on the amendment, I will ask Madame Ferrata to restate your amendment, and then we'll proceed to vote.
Est-ce que vous me dites
Can I dispense with reading the entire motion?
la motion
Do you want me to read the whole motion?
just the amendment part?
Yes,
Are we okay with that?
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry. Que conformément
That pursuant to Standing Order 109, the committee report its conclusions and findings to the House, and that the committee requests that the government table a comprehensive response to the report.
We've all heard the amendments. As the second, I will now. Do we have unanimous consent for the amendment?
Support.
Okay, the amendment is carried. Now we'll return to the main motion. Go ahead. We're now returning to the main motion as amended. Is there any discussion on the main motion as amended? I see no raised hand, so we'll proceed to the vote on the main motion as amended. Madam Clerk, record a vote.
Mr. Long,
Support and congratulations to MP Zarillo. It's a great motion.
Mr. Coteau,
Yes, in favor.
Mr. Collins,
Yes.
Mr. Van Bynen,
Yes.
Madame Martinez Ferrada,
Oui.
Ms. Kuzi,
In favor.
Mr. Generou,
In favor.
Mr. Benson,
In favor.
Mr. Ruff,
In favor.
Madame Chabot,
Oui, je vais me prononcer contre.
Against.
Cirillo.
4.
10 yeas, 1 nay.
Collins, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would like to introduce one of the motions that I had submitted to the committee, if you don't mind, and I believe the clerk has copies of it and has distributed it. And I'll read it for you if I could just introduce it first. My municipal background, for the last number of years, I've focused on affordable housing in Hamilton, and so I've waited several months to introduce a motion related to housing, a housing motion that will help not just people in my riding in Hamilton East, Stony Creek, and certainly not just in Hamilton, but delivering assistance to people across the country. And so we know that the pandemic has been hard on people, and we've seen in some communities our affordable housing wait lists get a little bit bigger. But we know that in response over the last number of years, the federal government has introduced a number of programs to assist not just municipalities, but nonprofits and other housing stakeholders. And so the motion that I have in front of you, and I'll read it to you, speaks to an existing program that the government has in place, and of course one that was advertised through the campaign and has received a lot of attention recently. And my motion reads, Mr. Chairman, that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake a study regarding options for the design and rollout of the government's proposed Housing Accelerator Fund, including but not limited to investments in staffing and technological support for municipal planning departments, property purchases, infrastructure upgrades, and policy development, including inclusionary zoning and transit-oriented development bylaws, for the purpose of reaching the government's goal of 100,000 new homes by 2024-25. That the study also investigate how the government can build on the Federal Lands Initiative to identify federally owned properties that might be made available to municipalities and or other stakeholders for the purpose of increasing housing supply, and that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House, and that pursuant to Standing Order 109, the committee requests that the government table a comprehensive response to the report. Thank you.
Motion's been moved. I'm going to call on Mr. Generou. You have your hand up. Mr. Generou, you have the floor. Then Mr. Coteau.
It would help if I unmuted. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I like a lot of this, and wondering if there's a possible way that we could merge it with mine, which basically looks at a lot of the similar programs, although we identify them in my motion, but also ties it into CMHC and the Minister of Housing talking about those programs. So if you're amenable to it, Mr. Chair, I will put forward an amendment to his motion.
You have the floor. You are going to move an amendment.
Yes. So the Collins motion, if I can just refer to it as that and not read it all out, but include the piece from my motion. In addition, that pursuant to Standing Order 108.2, that the committee invite the Minister for Housing and Diversity and Inclusion, and the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation to update the committee on the housing crisis, including but not limited to the National Housing Strategy, Rapid Housing Initiative, and the First-Time Home Buyers Incentive. End of amendment. I think what, and we'll get that to you in writing, Mr. Chair. I think what that does is it specifically outlines what I think Mr. Collins is getting at when he speaks about some of the government's proposed programs. In particular, the goal of 100,000 new homes by 2024-25. This just kind of outlines those 3 programs. Plus, it invites the CMHC to weigh in on this, and also the Minister for Housing and Diversity and Inclusion.
Thank you, Mr. General, and we will circulate that when we have it. Mr. Collins and then Madame Ferrata on the amendment.
Thank you,
proposed by Mr. General.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And through you, I certainly appreciate the offer in terms of the amendment. My concern is that my motion specifically is dealing with affordable housing. I know we have certainly 2 issues related to housing that have received a lot of attention in the House, and certainly a lot of attention in the Canadian public as it relates to housing affordability and affordable housing. And my motion speaks to the affordable housing component. My concern in terms of expanding the motion is that, as you know, the Minister and the Ministry have advertised to stakeholders input into the Municipal Accelerator Fund in terms of what it'll look like when it's funded. And so I'm anxious to understand how this committee can contribute to the comments that the Minister will receive and the Ministry will receive. I know my own municipality has submitted comments as it relates to their desire to see more affordable housing and what they'd like to see from the Municipal Accelerator Fund. I know that my own City Housing Hamilton, which is Hamilton's largest affordable housing provider, their request is they want land from the federal government. I think if we expand this, and with all due respect to Mr. Genereux, if we expand this into other areas, it gets into some of the comments and concerns we had on the last issue, and that is watering down the motion to the point where we spread ourselves too thin. So I'm all for talking about housing, and I will support other housing motions at this committee. There's just no doubt about that. But on this particular motion, I'd like to continue to focus on Municipal Accelerator Fund, understanding the timing, and knowing that the Minister will be before us on other issues quite soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Madame Ferrata, then Mr. Van Bynen. And my apologies, Mr. Van Bynen, for shortening your name earlier. Madame Ferrata.
Merci. Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I thank my colleague for the motion. This is an issue I care about very much, and I find it very important. We can see the crisis in housing across the country right now. And I also thank my committee colleague, Mr. General, for moving this amendment. But I think we should think about the fact that, first of all, the Minister will be appearing before the committee to speak about his mandate letter. And there is currently a study underway at the Finance Committee dealing with housing as well. And so I would like to propose to him that this time we stay concentrated indeed on what are the biggest needs just ahead of us, as my colleague moved in his motion. And I'd be very happy to support my colleague in the near future on another motion that would perhaps give us another look at this after we've seen what's happened at the Finance Committee and after we've heard from the Minister here, but that today that we could agree quickly on the fact that there are crying needs and programs that need to be put in place, that there's work to do with municipalities, and this Housing Accelerator Fund is really necessary. So I'd also like to say that I want to thank him for his interest in housing. And I think he has 2 motions that he wants to table dealing with housing, and I'd be very pleased to work with him on that for a future motion. And furthermore, the intent of this motion would allow us to invite the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation as witness without necessarily the motion being too broadened and watering down what it is that we're trying to do here for affordable housing. Thank you.
Ferretta, I will call on Mr. Van Bynen and then Mr. Genereux and Mr. Ruff. Mr. Van Bynen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And while I can appreciate the intent of the amendment, I think it's important for us to make sure that we focus on the way forward. There are some programs that have been announced, and I know that there are many municipalities that are eager to find a way to make sure that we start delivering the new options and the housing options, affordable housing options on the ground. And so I think that our greatest benefit would be to focus on the way forward and to make sure that we bring the municipalities in and again at all levels so that we can make sure that there's a program that we can implement going forward. And it's been mentioned earlier that finance is already looking at some of the elements that are being proposed in the amendment, and I'm agreeable as well to have CMHC focus on the way forward with us. And we will also have the minister in front of us when we're reviewing the mandate letters as we go forward as well. So there's plenty of opportunity to take a look at what's in place now. And if we want to do a deep dive on that, I think we probably have a more effective outcome if we focused on that at another time. But in my mind, the urgency is the way forward, and how do we develop programs so that that's deliverable on the ground at the municipal level or where people are seeking their housing.
Thank you, Mr. Van Bynen. Mr. Genereux, and I believe everybody has, and then I'll go to Mr. Ruff. Mr. Genereux, I believe everybody has the amendment that that we're now discussing. So, Mr. Genereux, you have the floor.
Yeah, I think you're right. I saw it come through, Mr. Chair. I'm making a habit of agreeing somewhat with Mr. Van Bynen today. We'll have to end this after today's meeting, but I think he's probably right with regards to the minister. I think there's probably getting the minister back on this one is an overreach right away, because he will already be here on the mandate. So I think it's I don't know procedurally how we would do this, Mr. Chair, but thinking that under where Mr. Collins puts the federal lands initiative piece and other stakeholders, I know we don't have to necessarily identify that in the motion, but certainly I think one of the other stakeholders might be the CMHC in that particular discussion, which would then get to some of the I think the questions that might have. So again, I don't know if we necessarily have to procedurally put that in terms of that, but knowing that will be a stakeholder that I will likely be submitting as part of this study. That's the first piece I wanted to address. So I'm happy to rescind my amendment if that's kind of the understanding of the committee, that's one of the stakeholders we'd like to pursue. And then also the second piece wanting to flag is just the Mr. Couteau's comments that he's looking forward to supporting housing motions put forward. And I do know that we have two housing motions on there. So hoping to move that next, Mr. Chair, if I'm able to get the floor once we deal with this one. Thank you.
Before the committee go, in fairness, Mr. Ruff had his hand up before the committee considers Mr. Genereux's position of rescinding his amendment.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously things changed a little bit there, Mr. Chair, with Mr. Genereux rescinding it, but just because it ties into the same sort of point that I wanted to raise, the importance of having the CMHC as one of the stakeholders. And as well, I'm a big believer, maybe it's the military background in me, of how things nest together. My biggest criticism and observations of a lot of federal programs is that lack of nesting and interconnection. And so I just think, the national housing strategy this is all part of it and what's being proposed here in that feedback. So if we're not even mentioning it, I just think we risk being disconnected on how everything interacts together. So, but in light of Mr. Generou rescinding the amendment, I think that ends this part, and we can maybe discuss if we're going to bring forth any other tweaks to the motion later. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Ruff. The committee, Madame Ferrata, did you want to speak?
Well, I was just, je voulais juste savoir est-ce que mon
I just wanted to know if my colleague is withdrawing the amendment. Is that correct?
Yep.
Oui, c'est ça, OK.
So, Mr. Generou, the committee needs to give unanimous consent for you to withdraw your amendment. So, are you requesting the committee to give unanimous consent? Okay.
Yes, I'm
Committee
requesting.
members? Okay, Mr. Generou, you have that consent, so your amendment is withdrawn. Now, Madame Ferrata, because we return to a debate on the main motion. Madame Ferrata.
Oui, merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank my colleague for his comments. And I would like to move another amendment. I think we could agree, perhaps, in the motion to suggest that this study that was proposed by my colleague, Mr. Chout, be studied immediately after the labor shortage study moved by my colleague, Ms. Zarillo. So I would move perhaps a formal amendment to the motion to say that Mr. Chad's motion, or study rather, would be the second one studied by the committee.
You heard the amendment to the motion. Any discussion? Seeing no discussion.
Sorry, I pushed the wrong button, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Do you mind if I just get a clarification? It's more of a process-related question. Is there a subcommittee as part of this committee that meets to discuss kind of the order of things? Because I know that's been successful in other committees that I've been a part of, that you, a member from the Liberal caucus, a member from the Conservative caucus, and a member from the NDP and Bloc caucus all meet together to kind of set that agenda item, which would then mean we don't necessarily have to include these as part of motions going forward. It could just kind of be a common understanding, but I guess just getting some clarification from you would help.
I'll ask the clerk to comment.
I'll just provide a quick comment. There is a subcommittee that has been adopted as per the routine motion that was adopted on December 13th. It is up to the chair and the committee if you should organize a subcommittee meeting.
Thank you, Madame Ferrata, and then Madame Chabot. Did you have your hand up, Madame Ferrata?
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And indeed, at HUMA, at the committee, we have regularly used the subcommittee to determine the priorities, but also always with the consent of the full committee, of course. So I'm not sure if it's a rule that is a watertight one. Depends on how each committee wants to function. But in any case, to make a priority of the labor shortages study and to have as a second study housing doesn't pose any problem for me. We will study these things at the committee, but we have to take into account that there are many more motions to come. And if we decide on the priority of the studies immediately, that might be problematic. But I hope we'll have time to present further motions today to see what order the studies will be done in and decide the priority.
Thank you, Madame Shabat. Madame Ferrata, but the amendment currently being debated would establish this as the second study.
Oui, merci.
Thank you to my colleague, Mr. Jenner, for posing the question. It clarifies the way the committee works. So if there's unanimous consent, I also will withdraw my amendment, and then we can move on. Thank you.
Is there unanimous consent for Madame Ferrata to withdraw her amendment? I see unanimous consent, so Madame Ferrata, that has been withdrawn. Seeing no further debate, then we will go to vote on the main. Madame Shabat, did you? No, okay. So we'll now proceed to a vote on the main motion of Mr. Collins. I'll ask for a recorded vote.
Mr. Long?
Support.
Mr. Coteau?
In favor.
Mr. Collins?
In favor?
Mr. Van Bynen?
In favor?
Madame Martinez Ferrata?
Oui.
Ms. Kuzi?
In favor.
Mr. Generou?
In favor.
Mr. Benson?
In favor.
Mr. Ruff?
In favor?
Madame Chabot?
Pour.
Ms. Cirillo?
In favor.
11 yeas, 0 nays.
I will now call on Mr. Generou. Mr. Generou, you have the floor.
This is a new motion you're entertaining,
Yes.
Mr. Chair?
Yes. Well, we've dealt with two motions currently.
Right.
So you have the floor,
so I will
Mr.
move.
General.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll move the motion that I just tried to make an amendment to initially, but we'll move the motion as a separate motion. Now that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee invite the Minister for Housing and Diversity and Inclusion and the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation to update the Committee on Canada's Housing Crisis, including but not limited to the National Housing Strategy, the Rapid Housing Initiative, and the First Time Home Buyers Incentive.
Thank you, Mr. Generou. You've all heard the motion. Madame Chabot, you have the floor.
Je la prends, mais c'est pas...
I wanted to speak because I wanted to table a motion. I'll wait.
Je peux le faire.
Okay. Thank you, Madame Chabot, but currently we have a motion moved by Mr. Generou. Madame Ferrata, you have the floor.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to thank my colleague for having tabled this motion, and I want to say that we will be supporting it.
I do not see Madame Zarillo on the motion of Mr. Generou.
Yeah, and I just wanted to ask potentially Mr. Generou, I have a motion on the Indigenous housing, and I just wonder if there's a way to fold this under when the minister comes, if we could also get an update on the Indigenous housing, and I don't know if that could fit under here as a sub-amendment.
Just amendment, Madame Zarillo. If you want to make an amendment,
I guess I'll suggest that as a sub-amendment, is that also when
as
the
an amendment.
Sorry.
Madame? As an amendment.
An amendment. I guess I'll suggest that as an amendment, that when, if it passes, that the minister is to come if the minister and the Minister of Indigenous Services can update this committee on progress on the strategy for the Indigenous housing as the government had committed to in 2017, that the committee invite each of these. That's it. I don't have to do the hour-long thing, but if they could come and speak to it.
Mr. Generou, then Madame Ferrata. Mr. Generou, do you have your hand up?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Zarillo. I think that's a great. I was reading that one and thought that was a great one. I think it's a standalone one. I also think you can fit it in already under where we said including but not limited to. I guess if it's the will of the committee to amend this, again, I think it's probably worthwhile of it being its own standalone one. But those are just my thoughts, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. General. Madame Ferretta, on the amendment of Madame Zarillo. Then I'll go to Madame Chabot.
Oui, merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to say the same thing, that it's really included in the wording of the motion. It allows for that. And moreover, the minister will be here to speak to his mandate letter, and it's included in that. And so he can report on that during his appearance. So what I'd like to propose to my colleague is to wait for the minister to appear and give us an update in his mandate letter appearance. And so if she feels at that point in time that she wants to bring that back in the future, I would be the first person to support it. So I would perhaps invite my colleague if she also would be prepared to withdraw her amendment so that we can keep the subject a little more limited and we can ask those questions of the minister when he appears before the committee.
Ferretta, Madame Chabot, and then Mr. Ruff on the amendment of Madame Zarillo.
On what Ms. Zarillo moved as an amendment, I can understand. I read her motion, and I participated in the study on the National Indigenous Housing Strategy. It was a very broad study, and the report was sent to the government, so there were recommendations made. But I think there are opportunities where we can ask those questions on an update and outside of the motion that's being presented here, or perhaps when the mandate letter appearance happens. I would rather prefer that route, particularly if we're talking about that strategy. The report was tabled fairly recently, so I think asking the minister questions during his appearance would be a good idea.
Madame Chabot, Mr. Ruff, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Look, Madam Chabot actually sort of captured my thought process on this fairly well. I just think that the key addition is obviously the Minister of Indigenous Services, and I think if we wait till we get the Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion here, we can ask those questions. We'll all be able to ask any of those questions on the Indigenous housing situation. If the answer's there, if he passes the buck to the Minister of Indigenous Services, then I think as a committee we can decide to call that minister forward at a future date following. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Ruff. Being a new member of the committee, Madame Zarillo, currently, do you want to proceed with your amendment? Or do you want to
do the
entertain?
withdrawal, a unanimous consent withdrawal, and we can discuss it again after we've seen the minister.
Okay, so you're requesting the committee, unanimous support of the committee to withdraw your amendment. Committee members, you've heard Madame Zarillo's. I see consensus of Madame Zarillo. Your amendment has been withdrawn. Seeing no further debate, we will proceed to a vote on Mr. Generoux's motion as presented. So is the committee familiar? I don't think we have to have it repeated. It's clear there was no amendments, so we'll now proceed to a recorded vote on the motion of Mr. Generoux.
Mr. Long.
Support.
Mr. Coteau.
In favor.
Mr. Collins.
Yep, absolutely. Support.
Mr. Van Bynen.
In favor.
Madame Martinez Ferrada.
En faveur.
Ms. Kuzi.
In favor.
Mr. Generoux.
In favor.
Mr. Benson.
In favor.
Mr. Ruff.
In favor.
Madame Chabot.
Oui.
Ms. Cirillo.
In favor.
11 yeas, 0 nays.
Is carried. Continuing on with committee business, Madame Chabot, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to table a motion that, let me find my place here. This one concerns a study on seniors that you received, and it reads as follows, and I explained what it's about, that it's written in terms as we were requested to present, that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake a study on the impact of COVID-19 on the financial, social, health, and overall well-being of seniors, that the committee review existing and announced programs for seniors, that the evidence and documents received by the committee during the second session of the 43rd Parliament regarding this study be considered by the committee during the current session, that the committee make recommendations to improve support for seniors, that the committee hold at least one 2-hour meeting on this matter, that pursuant to Standing Order 109, the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House, and that the committee ask the government to provide a comprehensive response to the report. So I explain the intention of the recommendation. You are many new members of the committee. Mr. Long, I appeal to your memory this. You were there during the session. We carried out a study on seniors, everything described here, and unfortunately, we weren't able to complete the study because we found ourselves at the end of the session, and then there was an election. So the goal here is not to redo this study and hear all these witnesses again. It's more to just complete the study that we had undertaken at the time, which is to say we were at the report stage, and to be able to table it with the government, because I would tell you that this was a significant study. We heard from many witnesses. We had many briefs sent to us. Many groups came and spoke to us about the objective, and it was very interesting. And I would find it unfortunate that all of that work just would disappear. So I think it would be wonderful if we could at least have one meeting where and perhaps the analysts could speak to us about where the draft report is at, and then from that point we could complete it and table the report with the government. That is the objective.
Madame Chabot, I'm going to go to Madame Ferretta and then Mr. Long, but before that, could the analyst, could you give the status where the report is as requested by Madame Chabot? Can the clerk speak to? Well, she referred to the analyst, but the what's the status of the report she was referring to? Could
Well,
clarify?
as Madam Chabot was clear, we did the study last Parliament, and as per motion, there was at least one 2-hour meeting that was initially projected to occur prior to the end of the last Parliament. The committee never had the opportunity to complete that last session, and so Madam Chabot's motion clearly outlines at least one 2-hour meeting on this matter to complete the study, and it'll provide the opportunity for the analysts to take into consideration all the material that was received from last Parliament and prepare a draft report for consideration of the committee.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Madame Ferretta and then Mr. Long.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't present for that study, but I understand that the issue is very important, and I would be very pleased to support my colleague on this motion. I'd be really interested to look at the work that was done, and I think that we really owe it to ourselves to support the work done by the researchers and analysts and really see it through to its end. And I think that if we can table a report, it would be in honor of this committee to do so. And I think if perhaps my colleague could clarify, Ms. Chabot, if I understand well, it's just an issue of completing the report and not having further witnesses, finalizing work done in the previous Parliament. If she could just clarify that. Or if does the motion leave it possible to hear from further witnesses?
Well, Mr. Long has the floor, then Madame Chabot. I will go back to you to respond to Madame Ferrata. Mr. Long?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Chair, I just wanted to certainly reiterate and thank MP Chabot for bringing this motion forward. It was a good study. We didn't have the opportunity to finish it off. And I fully support it. Again, I'll echo, it's not to recall witnesses or anything like that. It's simply to finish off the report. So it certainly has my support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Long. Madame Chabot?
Je confirme.
I confirm that the intention is not to re-invite further witnesses.
Thank you, Madame Chabot. Just as an informal, I just want an informal discussion. This could possibly be scheduled for Monday's meeting in the first.
Monsieur le Président, j'ai pas.
Mr. Chair, I have no sound. I can't hear anything.
Sorry, Madame Chabot. I'm just consulting with the clerk. I wasn't speaking. Just a moment.
Monsieur le Président, est-ce qu'on...
Mr. Chairman, could we take a 5-minute break, just to suspend for a few minutes, please?
We'll have a 5-minute suspension, Mr. Long and Madame Chabot. everybody present again, we will resume the meeting out of suspension. We're on the motion of Madame Chabot and Madame Kuzi. You have the floor.
Pardon me. We would be in support of this motion to return this study for completion and to the House. Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Kuzi. Seeing no further discussion on the motion of Madame Chabot, and then Madame Clerk, I shall go to a vote on the motion of Madame Chabot.
Mr. Long,
Support.
Mr. Coteau,
In favor.
Mr. Collins,
Support.
Mr. Van Bynen,
In favor.
Madame Martinez Ferrara,
En faveur.
Ms. Kuzi,
In favor.
Mr. Genereux,
Favor.
Mr. Benson,
In favor.
Mr. Ruff,
In favor.
Madame Chabot, Ms. Cirillo,
In favor.
11 yeas, 0 nays.
The motion is carried. No, I would just, okay. Yes, I was wanting to discuss, there's two items. We have been informed that the meeting is not being recorded, so we may not want to proceed much further, but it's will of the committee. But I just want a suggestion. Given Monday, the committee may want to consider having the analysts in camera to give.
It's one of the things that could be put together.
Just that providing the analyst is comfortable to be able to come and give a briefing on Monday during the first hour. That's an option, but we cannot confirm that. We'd have to check on the availability of the analyst. But Mr. Ruff, and then we'll go to Madame Chabot.
Well, I just reference your point here. The analyst here in specific reference to Madame Chabot's motion. Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Yeah, I guess as I expressed earlier, I don't think that's the right time. I think there's other committee stuff we could be dealing with.
Okay, that's fair. Madame Chabot? Did you have your hand up there?
No, we can go to Madame
Okay,
Chabot.
Madame Chabot?
Je discute.
I just wanted to discuss the agenda. If it was possible, I don't object to it, but it's to do this when we have an opportune time to do it, as soon as we can. But if there's a break in the schedule, if there's a spot, then we could do it. But I'll raise my hand later to table a new motion.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to the committee on timing and scheduling for the briefing, because I don't see a consensus on moving it on Monday. So, given that the motion's been carried, any further committee business? Madame Chabot had raised her hand, and then I'll go to Madame Kuzi. You have the floor.
Merci, je voudrais présenter.
Thank you. I'd like to table another motion, Mr. Chairman.
You have the floor.
Thank you. This is something that we proposed on December 13th, and you've received on the 15th, and it concerns the Temporary Foreign Workers Program. So pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the committee undertake a study on the effectiveness of the temporary foreign worker program and the LMIA process. That the committee invite the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development, and Disability Inclusion and all other relevant stakeholders to address this issue. That the committee hold a minimum of 4 meetings on this issue, and that the committee report its findings and recommendations to the House. I think that when we want to undertake this study, because it's a priority to deal with labor shortages, that temporary foreign worker issue is also a priority issue. And we also know that the government has the intention of revising this program, and so I think it would be appropriate for us to put it on our agenda as a study. And I think that my colleague, Ms. Zarrillo, had a similar motion that she wanted to move. Thank you.
You've heard the motion moved by Madame Chabot. Mr. Long, on the motion?
Yeah, Chair, the issue I have, we did a study on temporary foreign workers not that long ago, and I'm not sure if Madame Chabot has seen that study or read that study. I wouldn't think a lot has really changed. We brought in witnesses. We talked to companies. I remember specifically in Manitoba, I think we talked to High Lie and Maple Leaf Foods about temporary foreign workers and the challenges and things that they face, the challenges yet opportunities. So I'm not sure I can't support that one because we've the report's there. And I think that sometimes we're guilty of doing reports and ignoring the report that we've already done that's sitting on the shelf. So I would say on that one, I think we need to not support that one. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Ruff, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Look, I'm actually going to disagree with Mr. Long. I'm not disagreeing with the importance of going back and reading that previous report. I'll definitely look into that. But I think some things have fundamentally changed, in particular due to the pandemic that has impacted so many of our different sectors again that utilize the temporary foreign workers in the LMIA. So what I would suggest, us passing this motion as a future study isn't prioritizing it, and we can always come back and agree as a committee to not bring it forward as a priority if we all feel that the information in the previous report. So I guess I would request that the clerk ensure that previous report get distributed to all the new members of this committee, and that's one way we could then deal with it. But I actually do support the motion. Thanks.
Mr. Ruff, Madame Kuzi, and then Madame Chabot, and then Mr. Long.
Yes, further to Mr. Ruff's comments, I was hoping perhaps the clerk could provide the date that the last report was completed, because if it was prior to the pandemic, I do think certainly these labor shortages within the targeted sectors existed previously, but I believe they've been incredibly exacerbated by the pandemic and the current environment. So if we could find out what date that was, if it was completed in the last 18 to 24 months, even I think that's 18 months for certain. 24 months, 18 months, that's acceptable. But if it's previous to that, I do agree with Mr. Ruff's comments, and it may not be a priority given these other priorities we've identified, but it still remains a critical piece of solving the labor shortage as well. And I believe contributing to the economy well into the future. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Madame Kuzi. I will attempt to see if we can give it. Madame Chabot, you have the floor, then Mr. Long.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't have the pleasure of being with you in 2016. If I recall, well, that was the date of the last report. And so we were working on healthcare workers and childcare workers and at the time. So I think that the situation has changed. I'm not saying that there are components of the report that wouldn't be significant, but 5 years later, when we know within the context of the pandemic and the current context of the labor shortage, we have a situation that's been exacerbated by the pandemic, and we'll also see that demographics is part of this as well. So for some sectors, since I have been in this position in politics, I think that is something that really is of great concern to many businesses, the Temporary Foreign Workers Program. So we've been asked from all sides to look at the program and to seek changes in the process, and I think it would be a good time, a good moment to deal with this, particularly in the context of the labor shortages that we have now. So I think it would be a good idea to do this study.
Thank you, Madame Chabot. Just for the benefit of the members, the previous report was presented in the House on September 2016. Mr. Long, you have the floor, and then Madame Ferrata.
Thank you, Chair. And look, I know all of us certainly acknowledge that, yeah, I mean, we're in a pandemic and there's been a lot of challenges through that. But when we did this report in 2016, it was an extensive report, and we studied every sector. You know, I come from an aquaculture background. I'm on the East Coast. And, you know, I worked for actually a company called Stolt Sea Farm that doesn't exist anymore, but it was an international salmon company here in the East Coast. And I know the industry, the aquaculture industry, certainly has challenges with temporary foreign workers. And I was thrilled to do the study. And again, I want to certainly tell the committee that the study was extensive, extremely extensive. And we talked to every sector and had a lot of input, a lot of good testimony, a lot of very, very interesting witnesses that, again, I go back to the two companies in Manitoba, southern Manitoba, Maple Leaf Foods and Highline, they're pork producers, and the challenges that they face with respect to temporary foreign workers. It was actually fascinating that, you know, without the support of temporary foreign workers, they would literally leave, it was $1.2 billion on the table of unsold product. So again, I'm asking the committee to read that report and take my advice, take my free advice that what you want to get at and what you're looking for is already there. There's absolutely no need to do it again. And like I said before, I think that we get caught up at times, you know, doing a report, and then, you know, we feel good about the report, and then the report's shelved, and then, you know, a few years later, we want to do the report again. And on this one, there's just no need to do it. It's my opinion. It was a very extensive report. So I ask all committee members to take the time and get that report. And I just think that there's a lot of other important issues, Chair, that we can get at as a committee that we can bring forward that would be a lot more important to have an impact on so many Canadians from coast to coast to coast. So, Mr. Chair, again, I just want to certainly reiterate that I was a part of that study. It was extensive. It was a very, very good report. I ask all committee members to get it. And again, I can't support this because it's duplication. And I just think we have a lot more that we can do. Thanks, Chair.
Madame Ferrata, Mr. Coteau, and then Mr. Ruff want to speak. Madame Ferrata.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, we just voted on a motion that our colleague, Ms. Zabrillo, tabled on labor shortages, and the amendment tabled by my colleagues from the Conservative Party were intended to not limit it to the care economy. So I think that study will allow us to ask questions on this and on the subject since this report and since 2016 was tabled. I think we would be launching ourselves into a study that's already been done rather than having the minister that will be appearing before us on the mandate letter. And there's a study on the labor shortage that's coming shortly that will allow us to speak to some of the issues that interest my colleague, Ms. Chabot, on temporary foreign workers. So I would propose to her perhaps to wait a bit and see if we can have a more specific study on temporary foreign workers rather than looking at something that is such a broad issue. Myself studied the issue of temporary foreign workers when I was at the Immigration Committee, and I would invite you to go and read their report on that issue, and that is less than 1 year old. I would invite my colleague to look at the report, and I'd be pleased to discuss it with her. But I think if there's an issue that we really need to get to if we want to talk about temporary foreign workers, it is indeed the issue of immigration. So I think that should be launched as an idea there. And with this committee, we really have many other subjects that might be more of interest to us. And I can see that my colleague from the NTDP has a motion on persons with disabilities that is an issue that's extremely important. And I'd be most interested in launching into that kind of a study right now. And that is to say, supporting the most vulnerable people. We'll have the opportunity to talk about temporary foreign workers within other studies, and I think we should have some flexibility to undertake other studies. And so, unfortunately, I won't be able to support this motion. This study is too broad and too repetitive. We hear a lot about temporary foreign workers, but I think I would invite you all to reflect on what would be the best way to attack such a study.
Madame Ferrata, Mr. Coteau, and then Mr. Ruff, and we'll be conscious of the clock as well. Mr. Coteau?
Mr. Chair, what happens at 5:30? Do we just stop?
Yes, and then debate would resume at the next committee business, Mr. Coteau. Okay, so there's roughly 2 minutes left. I listened to what MP Long said in regards to previous studies on this subject matter. Of course, temporary foreign workers, it's an important component to fulfill labor shortages, increase productivity, and just really work to help build a better economy in this country. And in Ontario, I know it's something that, the province takes seriously in regards to its continued production and economic development. I think that if Mr. Long, being a previous member of the last committee, understands that there was a report that was commissioned by the committee, and he believes there's value there. As a new member, I would like to take some time to look at that report and have the ability to weigh in on the issue. What I don't want to do is repeat what was done in the past. And really, if something's been done, I think we owe it to ourselves not to commit to doing things over and over and repeating things. And this is obviously
something that, citizens don't want their policymakers, decision makers doing, just repeating the same thing over and over again. I would ask the committee to take a pause, consider looking at that report. I do know, I think we just passed a motion looking at labor shortages, which, would definitely include different strategies and components, including, I'm assuming, temporary foreign workers when it comes to just, increasing labor capacity. So I think that considering it's 5:30, maybe we move to adjournment and deal with this sometime in the future.
Thank you, Mr. Coteau. Just so that committee members are clear, there's two ways it'll come back. It'll resume debate at the next committee meeting under business, or Madame Chabot can reintroduce the motion. So by calling it 5:30 does not conclude it. It is 5:30. I would move that the meeting now adjourn. Agree. Thank you, committee members. There was a lot accomplished today. There's a lot of substantive motions currently before the committee, and at the next committee business, we have more on the agenda to discuss as well. So thank you. We have the minister scheduled, which was the primary desire of this committee. So again, thank you. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you on Monday.